Another thing I want to show you, though, is when you're dealing with today's jurors, X and Y particularly, you're proving two things. You prove the injuries before, the status, their case before, and then you prove their case after. And the case after, this is this young man. This young man, that's his graduation. And he's working a summer job, and this is the young man 6 months later after he's in a forklift rollover and he's rendered paraplegic. This is how you want to project the client. But you got to show the contrast. This is courage. You never project your client in sympathy. Sympathy won't work these days, and you'll see why in a minute, but sympathy does not work. So courage. The story is this person is doing the very best he can with what he has left. Now, kids today, the people on the jury today, they're very interested in technology. They want to see the latest thing. So here's the latest thing. This is a case I had where this fellow his face was actually hit by the bumper of an 18-wheeler. I mean, literally the bumper crushed his face, broke every bone in his body. I wanted to illustrate that, so I had a hologram made. This is you can't get the three-dimensional effect on this because it's just a slide, but it's a three-dimensional 40 by 60. One of the best pieces, one of the best exhibits I've ever had. It engages. The people stare at it. They can't take their eyes off of it. It shows the break. Here's, again, you have to show the difference. Prove what happened before. Prove the status before. This is a bright-faced, happy kid in San Diego, California. And then the next thing we see him, he's a 3 on the Glasgow Coma scale. But, you can talk about a 3 on the Glasgow Coma scale, but they have to see what that means. So you have to demonstrate it. I don't know if you're familiar with the Glasgow Coma scale. It runs from 3 to 15. At 15, you're phasing in and out of cognizance. At 8, you can be the claims manager of a major insurance company. And obviously at 3, you can be President of the United States. But so now let's talk about our jurors today. Generation X and Generation Y. They're a handful. Generation X, born 75. Now I'm going to fly through this because it's a lot of material. So Generation X, born 75 to 82. They're 31 to 49 years old now. They make up a good part of our jury. There's a very large body of them. They're the first lost generation. Their divorce rates, they were the first one that really ran into the highest divorce rates. They have more children out of wedlock and the absence of fathers. These are factors that influence the generation I'll show you how they impact us. Highest divorce rate. They ended up with disrespect. The first thing they ended up with was disrespect for the divorce laws, seeing their parents being divorced. They've had the dwindling education. They didn't have the GI Bill that the boomers had. So they had the dwindling education. They had infinitely higher crime rates than their parents had. The stability. They stay home longer. They're closer to their parents. They postpone independent living. And 51% admire parents the most. If you have a case involving the death of parents and you're representing the children, these are your folks. These people admire their parents, and they were the first generation to fully take responsibility for their aging parents. Both parents are outside the home. They grew up as extremely independent. This is an independent generation. They were the first victims of the Reagan social cuts. So their attitude is, this is where personal responsibility came from. They grew up with the attitude that nobody's going to take care of me. I got to take care of myself. My parents are not here. The government's not going to do anything for me. I'm on my own. No reliance on the government. They take care of their own health care. And the result is, since they weren't provided anything by the government, they have no respect for the government. They have no deference to the government. The next thing, employment. If you think you're going to make a case to these guys about lost wages and being off work and you got injured and couldn't go back to work, they have no job security whatsoever. They have no confidence. Job security to Generation X means having your own business, being in business for yourself. They were the first declining wages generation. First generation in the history of this country who made less money than their parents. It's the post-Nixon attitude towards politics. It's the weakest attachment to political parties. The lowest voter participation was Gen X. No belief in politicians. The reason they have the X factor is they had no common enemy. They didn't have a rallying point like World War II or like 9/11. They didn't have a rallying point in their history. No clear idea who they are, no clear rallying points, no clear national principles. They're conservative. They are conservative. They have a conservative mentality. They're cautious and practical. They reject hype and insincerity, which wipes out my closing arguments across the board. Reject overstatement and flash. They resent conspicuous consumption. So there's a considerable, this is a huge difference. The things that sold to boomers won't sell to these folks. More conservative than the boomers, they're skeptical towards blind liberalism, and they're skeptical towards the anti-corporate mentality. Remember how we used to stand up and begin the case with, ladies and gentlemen, this is just one more case of corporate greed placed ahead of consumer safety. You can't do that. They reject this generation. You can't do that anymore. There are two reasons. One, they reject the anti-corporate mentality, but the other is many of these people today they regard themselves as owners of corporations because they have so much money put into their savings accounts and so forth, their savings funds that are in the stock market. So they identify a lot more with the corporate with the corporations than their parents did. They reject the boomer rhetoric regarding underdogs or evil corporate America. They don't buy into that. Equality for all to them is just idealistic political rhetoric, and that comes from the whole government situation, that the government doesn't do anything to take care of them. So this was the perfect generation to sell tort reform to, and this is where tort reform came from. The whole personal responsibility thing. Nobody helped me, so why should I help this injured plaintiff? Now, they're like their brethren, their younger kids, they learn best through imagery. They're not seduced by flashy advertising, and they reject and recognize flashiness. They believe more in UFOs than in the receipt of Social Security. And this was interesting. Only 25% described themselves as religious. Now, this was the first, they're visually educated. So this is when we really came into full bloom with our demonstrative evidence. Belli taught us all about it, but then this generation is the one that really resonated strongly with them because they're moved more by images than by words. They learn best by multimedia, and they multitask. Spoken words alone to them are boring. Now, this is Gen X. You get this squared with Gen Y. Gen Xers as juror advocates will often disagree and clash with their opinionated boomers who are their parents, a high regard for long-established traditions, and this is important to us, plans to uphold traditions. They relate to cases where traditions were broken. In a malpractice case, for example, they resonate to the Hippocratic Oath, to things like the Hippocratic Oath and the traditions of the jury system. Don't understand exactly why, because they don't like other parts of government, but they did like the jury system and they resonated to the jury system. So these are the people that you want to use. This is why rules of the road are so important with them. And it's even more important with the next generation, which is Gen Y. They're persuaded by themes dealing with ethics, rules and morality, protocols and med mal, safety rules and regulation, and rules of the road. So with either Gen X or Gen Y, when you have a broken rule, don't just talk in terms of the rule. If it's something as fundamental as they broke the rule about speeding on a highway, don't just talk about speeding. blow up the log, blow up the rule, and show it to them. This is the rule that they broke. Let them see. Make sure that you hit them hard with the rules, the safety rules, because they resonate with it. They were very strongly raised with rules. They relate to themes that appeal to their pragmatism, hope for the best, plan for the worst. They resonate to themes that deal with loss of independence and self-reliance. They are self-reliant. So if you talk in terms of how your injured plaintiff has lost his or her self-reliance, they identify with that because they're strongly self-reliant themselves. If you talk about how you stress how your injured paraplegic has lost his independence, he's lost his mobility, and he's lost his self-reliance. Those are very, very strong defining Gen X characteristics. So you stress the courage and the courage that your plaintiff is doing the best they can with what they have left. There's no need for appeals to sympathy, and it would be very stupid to use them. Avoid compensating the victim. Never use the word victim anymore because in a courtroom, because in a survey, the majority of men, when asked the question, who is the victim in a lawsuit, the majority of men said the victim was the defendant who was being sued. True. Majority of women said it's the injured party, but majority of men think of the victim. So we just stay away from the word victim. You should be, before you get to the courthouse, you should be ready to answer this question, because this question will come up in some form in the jury room. We've seen it from jury after jury after jury from studies that were done. They will always end up asking the question, what good purpose will be served by an award of damages in this case? So you should think that through. What use is going to be made of the money in this case? But not just the use of the money, but what other purpose? Is it exemplary? Is it punitive? Even though it's only compensatory damages. You have to prove to the plaintiff, you have to prove to the jury these days that it's not just simply the plaintiff in need, but you have to prove that the plaintiff is worthy of their help. And worthy of their help starts with this. Ask the question, what is this plaintiff doing for himself? What is he doing to improve his own case, his own life, his own situation? And so you should always have a rehabilitation plan, unless if you have a plaintiff where you are seeking present day damages because they're still injured, or you're seeking future damages because they're permanently injured or they're going to be injured for a long period of time in the future, you should have a definite plan for what are you doing to rehabilitate yourself right now. What is your plan for rehabilitating yourself in the future? That can include things like, well, if I can afford it, I'm going to do this and this and this. I'm going to have this equipment. I'm going to go through these programs and so forth. But you have to prove that they're worthy of their help. Plaintiffs should have a definite plan for rehabilitation and explain how money will make a difference in the life of the plaintiff. More than any other generation, the Xers reject whiners and seek to help those who help themselves. So it's important to show that the injured person will suffer significantly for a long time if you're going to try to get long-term damages. Xers are cautious and practical. They don't respond to hyperbole, drama, and overstatement. They'll call you on it in a minute. They'll call you on it in the jury room. Keep emotional appeals in their proper place and perspective, but you don't raise emotional appeals until closing argument. You don't make that appeal till the closing argument. And you absolutely don't make that appeal until you've proven why. One of the dumbest things you can do, in my opinion, is to come in and start talking about and proving your damages very early in your case or in your voir dire examination. You want the jurors to discover the damages for themselves. They're much more persuaded for what they feel like they discovered on their own. So if you come in with someone who has permanent, irreversible brain damage, you don't start out on voir dire by saying, this is a case where the plaintiff has suffered permanent, irreversible brain damage. We start out with a head injury. Plaintiff suffered a head injury, and then you move through it. You move from a head injury to a severe head injury, and then you move to it, and it's not until your doctor testifies that this is permanent, it's irreversible, this is something this plaintiff will live with forever. Now you can talk about, but you want the jury to be thinking, okay, it's a head injury. Oh, okay, this is a severe head injury. Oh, okay, and then let them discover, preferably ahead of your expert testifying to it, that this is a permanent damage. They've discovered it on their own, they'll embrace it. But then you save your emotions. I always try to save any emotional appeal to the closing portion of the closing argument when it can't be responded to anymore. So avoid a sense of entitlement by your client. Show that the injured party is doing the best they can with what they have, and they're motivated to improve on their own. And sequence your story so that you have the proof to back up your allegations. You should sequence your story with your conscious mind appeal evidence, the hard evidence first, because you want to establish that there is a wrong here, there is negligence here, because we found that in jury surveys you can be putting on information about the damages, and essentially the jury is sitting there thinking, okay, yeah, but what does that have to do with me? So you've got to establish your credibility first. Remember, you only get one chance to make a first impression. So you come in with your hard evidence first. Come in with things that they can see and touch and feel, and they got real numbers, and they got real actual hard evidence that can't be disputed. Then you work your way more into your general damages and your general evidence. So you sequence your story in that fashion to show that you have the proof to back up your allegations, and avoid being one of the boomers that they mistrust. And that's avoid the hyperbole and the overstatement and that type of thing, because they'll call you on it. Prime the information as in a news story headline: who, what, when, where, why, and how. That's how you lead into a news story. And then while the extras mistrust the boomer generation, they value a close relationship with their own family and parents. They place family and quality of life ahead of a career. So again, they make very good jurors for you if you're talking about an injury that destroyed a family, or hurt a family, or impaired a family. Gen X is 21 to 30 years old now. They were born 83 to 92. They're totally tech-oriented. 97% own computers, 94 own cell phones, 76 do instant messaging, 92% do multitasking, which is usually texting while they're driving. These folks won't talk to each other. What the hell makes you think they're going to listen to you? They seriously will not talk to each other. They can be sitting at the same table texting each other. So in order to get these people, you got to get their attention, you've got to get their focus, you have to have interactive presentations. You have to be able to get and hold their attention, understand their motivations, and you show and tell, mostly show, and standard focus techniques. There's the second largest population, 38% identify as non-white, self-identify as non-white. More liberal Democrat than ever. 50% are in college. Now, you're not going to get a lot of sympathy or empathy from Gen Y on a wage loss claim because 20% of them are unemployed. You say, yeah, you think you got a problem? Let me tell you mine. They have less health insurance than any generation. They have the highest rate of obesity, and they have concerns regarding their declining health. They feel the government should do more as opposed to their previous. The Gen X thinks the government should stay the hell out of my life. Gen Y thinks the government should do more. They have an adverse view of business. They want a job with self-esteem. They're heavily burdened with school debt. They're living with their parents longer, largely because they're heavily burdened with school debt. And they can't find a job when they get out. They have a closer relationship with their parents. So if you have a case involving damage to the family, Gen X or Gen Y, either one is good for you. Their defining events are 9/11, the dot-com failures, corporate corruption, a divided country. They have untrustworthy politicians, the Iraqi wars. They were raised with a rhetoric. Both of these generations, X and Y, were raised with a rhetoric of tort reform. You know, the boomers had to learn it. Gen X and Gen Y think greedy trial lawyer is one word. And so they have they've heard the anti-lawyer rhetoric their entire life. The difference is this, and it's an important difference. The Generation X group had the tort reform just blasted to them. All the attacks on lawyers that happened, most of the attacks that started around 78 and through the 80s and 90s, that happened to Generation X. And I mean, they got the blast. Now, Generation Y, they're not having to blast us so hard anymore because basically places like Texas, hell, they've won. So they got no reason to waste money on TV ads anymore. And so there's a lot less attacks on lawyers now than there were in those years. So Gen Y is not nearly as anti-lawyer as Generation X is because they weren't spoon-fed all the attacks on lawyers. Gen Y, lack of security, shrinking salaries, shrinking opportunities, outsourcing of jobs, and they're victims of downsizing. They want time for their personal life, the opportunity for advancement, personal growth, security. They go for the intrinsic nature of the work. They're very good team members, and they want the opportunity for leadership. As opposed to being self-reliant and independent and individual, Gen Y is very much team-oriented. And when you think about it, the difference there, and this is why rules of the road and protocols are so important. They resonate more with this group than with anybody, because look at how these kids were raised. Everything they did was organized. You know, when I was a kid, we wanted to play baseball. We'd get the baseball, the guys with the gloves, we'd walk around the neighborhood, we'd go over to the yard, and people would come, and we'd just all start playing. These kids have organizations that they play in, teams, organized sports, you know, from age 4 on up. Everything they do is teams, and everybody gets a trophy. But they learn rules. Everything's done by rules. We made up our own rules as we went along. Everything's done by rules. So they are completely, totally oriented towards rules. And so tap into that with Gen X and Gen Y both. Tap into their completely oriented towards rules, and they respect rules. So try your cases in terms of rules, protocols, and things of that nature.